On today's show, Alperen Sengun selected as the Western Conference Player of the Week, plus a look at his all-star chances this season. Then we'll dive into some good and bad Rockets trends over these last 5 to 10 games, plus the biggest roster needs for this team right now. It's all coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start.
Throw it up to Jalen Green.
Sengun here in the short row. Oh, my, that's the no-look.
Jabari for three and the win. Yeah!
Look at Tari, Eason.
Here comes Tari. Oh!
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal.
The Houston Rockets select Thompson and Cam Whitmore.
One thing I have never done is not made the playoffs, and so we want to take that step here as well.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Mondays. Be sure to follow along on Twitter at JT Gatlin and the show, of course, at Locked On Rockets, free and available wherever you listen to your podcasts, including YouTube. Now, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more with FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. And as always, thank you so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you for being an everydayer and making the show part of your day every single day. Joining us now is none other than the podfather himself, Rockets Wire editor and host of the Logger Line podcast, Ben DuBose. You can track down on Twitter at Ben DuBose, here for a variety of Rockets topics today. We got a bunch of stuff we're going to get to on today's show. Ben, we're going to talk a little bit about Alperen Sengun winning Player of the Week, the first Rocket to win the award since James Harden. So that's been a minute. He's also the youngest player in franchise history to earn the honor there. We'll also talk about some of the good and bad trends with this Rockets team as of late over these last 5 to 10 games or so, as well as what the biggest need is for this roster right now. So let's start with Alpi, Ben, because first off, he's been the Rockets' best player all season long. It's been incredible to see his year 3 leap that he's taken, and to kind of, I don't want to say like, for him to be vindicated, to like win the award, but it's just, it feels good, right? To have a player who's out there winning awards and there's tangible like results to be like, hey, look at what the Rockets are doing. What we're doing is actually good. And we've got a player that we can actually cheer for and be like, hey, you're doing good things. And now we can reward you with those good things by honoring you as the player of the week.
Yeah, absolutely. In some ways, it feels like shifting to another phase in that we went into this season talking about the core 6 of prospects, and there still are 6 core prospects, but right now one of those 6 has taken a leap to where we're not just talking about potential, we're talking about someone who is a star right now. And so as things stand, he's the face of the franchise, and this sort of feels symbolic in that now it is Alperen Sengun's team. Now, that's not to say that someone else out of that core 6, and hopefully more than one out of those core 6, can't eventually join Alpi at a later date in that top tier. But for now, he's the guy that's honestly been the storyline for the first 30 plus games of this season. And it just feels like actually seeing him get that honor on a league-wide scale, well, Western Conference, but still to see him in that rare air, something that hasn't been done by any Rocket since November 2019, James Harden, the youngest ever to do it in franchise history. It just feels like one of those sort of symbolic, shifting of phases into which we're now at a point where, yes, this is Alperen Sengun's team. It's possible someone joins him in that tier down the line. But for now, the Rockets will go as Alpi takes them. And that's sort of been the story of this overachieving season to date.
Alperen Sengun last week, for the week that he received the honors, he averaged 24 points per contest, 7 rebounds, and 4.5 assists per game. Rockets with a 3-1 team record for the week of week 11 of the season, so January 1st through 7th. Now, when we look at Alperen Sengun, right, one of the milestones, one of the things that we hope that he's able to kind of achieve this year is an all-star selection. That would be something that would kind of be the cherry on top of an already, impressive Rocket season as far as expectations are concerned. They're still playing, they're still very much ahead of schedule. Alperen Sengun with the year 3 leap, he's looked incredible. And it would be yet another thing to just kind of, reward him for his play, to be like, hey, no, this is the Rockets guy, right? This is the face of the franchise now. He is kind of taking ownership of his role on this team and playing to the best of his ability, and playing winning basketball is the other thing, right? He's not just a star. He's not just a talented player putting up a bunch of, gaudy stats on a bad team. It's just, he's actually putting up good stats on a good team that's playing winning basketball.
A team that's overachieved, and to your point, last week they were 3-1.
The issue, though, is as much as I think Alperen Sengun's play is worthy of an all-star selection, I feel like the more that I think about it, it's going to be incredibly difficult for him to actually get the all-star nod. If only because the West is just so unbelievably stacked, right? So you'll have the 5 starters in the West, and then you'll have 7 reserves, so 12 total selections. He's not going to make it as a starter. That much is clear. Like, it's not going to happen, unfortunately. Turkey has done, shout out to Turkey, who's done an absolutely miraculous push, on different social channels, different prominent figures, trying to gas up Alperen Sengun, saying vote for him, all of that. That's been incredible. But I just don't think it's going to be enough for him to get the nod as a starter. So there's 7 reserve slots to pick from. And I think at this point, Ben, it's not that there's 7 clear-cut players who are better than Alperen Sengun. He's very much in the discussion with those guys, whether it's Anthony Edwards, Rudy Gobert, I don't know, Domantas Sabonis. Like, there are a lot of guys in that conversation who very much have their own claims to being an all-star. But where I do think we have a slim chance of hope here is the reserves are selected by the coaches in the NBA. And it feels like every single game, opposing players and opposing coaches have nothing but great things to say about Alperen Sengun and how difficult he makes their lives in having to game plan for him, and having to play against him, in just the way that he plays the game. And I think that level of respect, like peer-to-peer respect, might have enough that he might, actually find himself in the All-Star game, simply because of the respect that he commands from opposing players and coaches.
We should also note that most years that 12 becomes 13 or 14, because the odds are there is going to be a late injury withdrawal for one reason or another. And then the replacements get selected, I believe, by the league office, but I think there's some consultation with the coaches and some deference to the ballots they previously put together. So when we say top 12, most years it becomes top 13 or 14. So you look at the coaches' comments, I'm encouraged by that. The other thing that makes me have a little more optimism for the Rockets being able to pull this off, I love the fact that this honor of Western Conference Player of the Week, this was submitted by their in-house PR department, led by Tracy Hughes. They do a great job. Sean McCloskey does a wonderful job of putting together the numbers, the data, and the way the Player of the Week, the Player of the Month awards work is that while they are decided by the league office, it's the teams themselves that submit on behalf of their players and make the case. It's sort of like, putting together a legal argument, if you will, and then the judge is people, or jury are people in the league office who then sort of sift through the presentations and decide who is sort of most deserving, I suppose, at least based on the submitted data, the submitted information. And where this has a correlation to the All-Star voting, for reasons you described earlier, Alpi is not going to be a starter unless he's an injury replacement and multiple guys withdraw. Because the reality is the fan voting, top 3 Western Conference front court, Nikola Jokic, LeBron, KD. 3 global brands, guys that have been MVP level players for years and years. Alpi's having a great year. He's not to that level yet, and that's okay. He's just 21 years old. The path is as a reserve, and fan voting has nothing to do with the selection for reserves. That's done by coaches who will go through A, their own analysis, and B, presentations that are made from other teams. I know the Rockets are working on sort of a package for Sengun, if you will, that they will send to other teams that hopefully they'll show to their coaches when they're breaking down film and having these discussions, in much the same way that other teams will submit things to the Rockets in hopes that, the Rockets will show it to Ime Udoka and they will take that into consideration. So beyond the fact that Sengun is already drawing all this praise from coaches who talk about what stands out on film when they see him and how much attention he draws each and every night for the Rockets, I also think the fact that the Rockets submitted basically a winning presentation to the league office for this Player of the Week award, hopefully that speaks well to the presentation they're able to put together to submit to teams who hopefully show it to their coaching staffs for this all-star vote in the coming weeks. Because what's going to win it's not a populist campaign on Twitter. I know there's been this sort of pushback in recent days about, are the Rockets doing enough promotion on Twitter for Alpi's candidacy? And I do think it's picked up of late as Alpi's play has gone to even another higher level over the last week to 10 days. But it's just important to remember that opposing coaches are not going to be scrolling through Twitter. They're going to be looking at it through much more of a basketball diehard perspective. And so for the Rockets to be able to make that campaign successfully to the league office, that should give you at least a little bit of confidence that they can put something together that will also resonate with opposing coaches when they vote later this month.
No. NBA head coaches get their game plans exclusively from NBA Twitter. That's at least what I was told. Ime Udoka is just browsing Twitter the whole time, just trying to figure out how he's going to, come up with this defensive game plan for the next game. No, I kid, of course. Look, I think Alperen Sengun has a strong chance to make it for all the reasons that we just laid out here. The Rockets are doing their part. Alpi's doing his part. He's playing at an all-star level. It's ultimately going to be up to the opposing coaches, the other 29 teams in the association, or at least the other 14 teams in the Western Conference, to figure out if Alpi's going to be worthy of an all-star selection. And maybe a little bit of injury luck here and there might not hurt things if he can sneak in as a reserve this season. But give us your thoughts on Alperen Sengun's all-star candidacy in the YouTube comments. Coming up, we want to get into some good and bad Rockets trends over these last 5 to 10 games or so. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL regular season is wrapping up, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. And all you have to do is wager $5. It's that easy. The app is so simple to use, and there's so many different ways to bet, like live, same game parlays, find bets in the new Explore tab, make a parlay in the Parlay Hub, the best way to find popular parlays, and so much more. Right now, you can take a look at the outright betting favorites for this year's Super Bowl. The San Francisco 49ers at plus 220 to win it all. The Ravens right behind them at plus 320. Buffalo Bills at plus 650. Dallas Cowboys plus 750. And the Kansas City Chiefs sitting on the outside looking in at plus 1,000. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get in on the action this NFL postseason. Again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, Ben, I'm going to let you drive the bus here for a second. Do you want to talk a good, positive Rockets trend or a bad Rockets trend?
Let's start with bad, because the last segment was good. We talked about sort of passing the torch or moving on to this new Sengun era that this Player of the Week award symbolizes. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum and do something not so good.
Okay, we'll make it like a sandwich. We'll do the good, then the bad, and hopefully some more good to, on the back end of it. The last 8 games or so, directly coinciding with Dillon Brooks' absence from the Rockets lineup, their defensive rating has plummeted. Their defense has not looked great. And now that also coincides with some absences from Tari Eason, who's missed, I believe, the last 4 games it is. Yeah, 4 games in a row. So not exactly great, missing 2 of easily your best defender in Dillon Brooks, and then one of your top, 3 defenders in Tari Eason. I think you could make the argument Tari's probably the second best defender on the team. Maybe you argue Fred VanVleet, just IQ, experience, whatever. Point is, those are 2 of your best defenders on the team. However, I think what I want to get to here is I don't know if this is necessarily just a personnel issue over these last 8 to 10 games or so, or if this is an issue that's a little bit deeper than that, where we're starting to see, teams maybe take advantage of some schemes against the Rockets, right? We're seeing like the way the Miami Heat did, how they fully exposed the Rockets defense and how aggressive they are in their switching scheme, how teams that play with a lot of motion, teams that share the basketball well and move well without the basketball have been able to expose the Rockets defensively. So is this something that is of concern that maybe is something that we need to point the finger at Ime Udoka and say, hey, we need better defensive game plans against teams that have high motion offenses like the Miami Heat do? Or is this simply just a personnel issue where if they had Dillon Brooks and Tari Eason, we're probably talking about a win against the Heat instead of a loss?
A little bit of both, but I do think that there were at least some signs of this prior to the Dillon Brooks injury, which happened midway through the Indiana game that Tyrese Halliburton went off. In my opinion, one area where the Rockets were a little bit lucky to start the year. If you looked into the shot luck data, I would say for the first 5 to 6 weeks of the year, teams miss shots against the Rockets that they typically make, or at a greater rate, I should say. And that tends to happen. You'll go through weeks where the bounces go your way, and you'll go through other stretches where teams, it feels like they can't miss against you. And after 82 games, it generally evens out. But where I think the Rockets, aside from missing the point of attack defense of Dillon Brooks in particular, have sort of regressed in recent weeks, is that as opposing teams make more shots, you see a bit too much panic, in my opinion. And I think you especially see it from the younger guys like Jalen and Jabari, who end up helping far too often. And so when you get in a game like last night against the Heat, where all of a sudden they make a couple of threes and they're constantly moving, then the temptation is to always help, and be it an open three or someone cuts backdoor because you close out on a three too hard. There's always something that is there for a disciplined offense to take if the defense is that undisciplined. And I don't think it's everyone. I think it's disproportionately the younger guys, but we should also mention that on top of Jalen and Jabari being as young as they are, you're also trying to play Amen Thompson and Cam Whitmore additional minutes with all of these injuries that you're trying to withstand at the moment. So because of that, I think you've just seen a Rockets team going through, beyond the injuries, just typical bad habits associated with younger teams, which is that if it's a game like last night where it feels like the Heat can't miss from three, then there's a tendency to overcompensate, to overhelp, and then that can get you beat in other areas as well, especially if it's a team like the Heat that's willing to move the ball and willing to move without the ball and cut straight to the rim. And that it sort of puts Ime Udoka in a tough spot, because we can look at the per 36 numbers and say, wow, especially in this stretch without Dillon and without Tari, it's not just the defense. Honestly, the offense, I feel like, has suffered a bit as well, because Jae'Sean Tate is just not as dynamic as Dillon and Tari are. He can't make shots from as many places on the floor. I know his 3-point percentage this year is actually respectable. It has ticked up a little bit, but it's primarily from the corners. And so there is a bit of a hit to your spacing that does make it harder for Alperen Sengun to operate in particular. We saw that against a very disciplined defense of the Heat. And so in a perfect world, you would love to throw out more shooting, more athleticism of a guy like Cam Whitmore. But then there's the trade-off defensively. Are you willing to, in pursuit of greater offense, greater shooting, are you willing to give up even more defensively and lean in even more to these trends that I was just describing? So that's sort of the delicate balance for the Rockets. I just think that besides just missing in terms of X's and O's personnel, the point of attack defense, I also think you're just seeing some habits that are typical of young players, especially if you're in a stretch, which it feels like the Rockets largely have been of late, where opponents are making their shots against you.
Yeah, the Rockets defense over these last 8 games specifically has plummeted to, they would be at 117.6 defensive rating, which would be good enough for bottom 10, 21st of 30 over these last 8 games specifically. So a far cry from the top 2, top 3 defense that they've kind of, held down for a majority of the season. And again, that identity, it's not that the identity has completely gone away. I still feel like the identity is there. They are a defense first team. And I will agree, I do think it's partially personnel, right? You're missing Dillon, you're missing Tari. But great point on the young guys, right? It felt like so many times in that Miami Heat game where you would see Jalen or Jabari cheating over and trying to scramble to help on another man, or even you'd see Alpi at times closing out because he's just trying to get to, the next shooter, and then he closes out to the wrong guy. Unfortunately, it leads to a wide open corner three because he's closing out to the wing instead. And there were just so many mix-ups defensively, and that's what a team like the Miami Heat does, right? If you don't have good game plan discipline defensively about what you're supposed to do, who you're supposed to stay home on, all of that, then it's going to come off the rails at some point. And the Rockets were able to kind of counter that a little bit with their shot making in the first half, 10 of 23-point shooting in the first half of that game, going to halftime tied. But then when the well dried up offensively and you were making, some of the unforced errors defensively, then it led to the loss that we saw, unfortunately.
I also say that on top of missing the point of attack defense, I also think not having Tari's length has been a little problematic because you don't really have that weak side rim protection that at times Tari with his length and instincts can give you, because this is a Houston team that does not really have a rim protector. We know what Alpi is in terms of his style of play. And then beyond Alpi, it's typically Jeff Green as your backup center. Jock Landale didn't work out. So there's no traditional center at all when Alpi isn't on the floor. And so because of that, you really need some long, rangy types with good instincts, which Tari Eason typically is, to sort of prevent those backdoor cuts from being as damaging. Whereas when Tari's not out there and you don't have the length and you don't have a backup center and you don't really have rim protection to begin with, then a team that's very disciplined about making those types of cuts and knows how to move the ball can punish you over 48 minutes, and especially the minutes when Alperen Sengun isn't on the floor.
Plus just Tari's rebounding in general. I mean, having another guy out there who soaks up the boards the way that he does is always a huge plus for any team.
Don't get as many second possessions. Yep.
Yeah. I want you, so if you're listening to the show, remember we brought up a couple key points here, right? The lack of shooting, the lack of interior size when Alperen Sengun goes to the bench. Keep those points in mind as we get to one of our final topics on today's show, biggest roster needs right now. But coming up, we're going to get to the good trend as of late. We'll talk about Jalen Green's shooting percentages here, the three ball falling at a better clip. But is it real or is it fake? And that's what we're going to talk about here in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Around New Year's, we get obsessed with how to change ourselves instead of just expanding on what we're already doing right. Maybe you finally organized one part of your space and you want to tackle another, or maybe you're taking supplements every morning and now you want to actually eat breakfast to go along with it as well. Therapy helps you find your strengths so you can ditch the extreme resolutions and make changes that really stick. I've done therapy in the past and I found it incredibly helpful in my own personal life. So if you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Celebrate the progress that you've already made. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, Ben, we're shifting gears back to a positive trend, at least what looks like a positive trend. I say it looks like because, and I can already hear it now on the Twitter streets, people crying, clamoring, he's a hater, he's got an agenda against Jalen, all of it. I can hear it now. But look, Jalen Green's three-point percentages over these last 10 games. He is shooting just under, a hair under 39% from three these last 10 games. So 0.387. All right. That's a really respectable number. That's great. Now let's dive into it. Let's get a little bit deeper into this, right? Let's go through some of these game logs and look at the numbers. 3 of 7 against the Dallas Mavericks. 0 of 4 against the Pelicans. 0 of 3 against Indiana. 6 of 12 against the Suns, 5 of 9 against Philadelphia, 5 of 9 against Detroit, 3 of 9 against Brooklyn, 4 of 8 against Minnesota, 1 of 6 against Milwaukee, and then 2 of 8 against Miami. So I get it that these are percentages and that over the course of an 82-game season, if Jalen Green averaged out to 39% shooting, that would be a godsend. That would be incredible. But what I'm seeing when you actually look at the game-by-game numbers is you're still seeing the pendulum swings from one game he's hitting all his threes, the next game he's missing all his threes, and then back and forth and back and forth. It's not like he's suddenly a reliable, like 2 of 5, 3 of 6 every game kind of shooter. It's some nights he's on and some nights he's really off. And so I don't know if the positive trend of the three-point shooting is suddenly like this new development where, oh, he's a great shooter now. He's still really streaky, unfortunately, is what I'm seeing.
And the other thing that stood out as you were reading off the game log is the three-point attempts. This goes back into the idea, in my opinion, that Jalen is something of a rhythm player, in that when he feels the game out and things are going his way, he's going to put up more shots. He builds confidence. What's tricky on this particular team, where the foundation is Alperen Sengun and to a slightly lesser extent Fred VanVleet, is that ideally you want Jalen to be, I don't want to say a third wheel, but someone who can function off ball and space the floor. And you can just see that when the threes aren't going his way in a given game, the Miami game, perhaps an exception to that, he becomes more reluctant to take them. And now I know there's a little bit of a chicken or the egg, because you can also point out that, well, it also might make Ime Udoka less likely to play him. So it sort of goes hand in hand there. But the bottom line, it ties in with the season-long theme as I see it, which is the first couple of years of Jalen Green's career, Stephen Silas ball, which was basically no structure, just dribble the ball up the court, your turn, my turn, whose turn is it to cook? You know the memes. And Jalen got into the habit of just being able to shoot his way out of a slump. And maybe it didn't happen in a given game, but over 2-3 games, he would typically find it, and he was going to have enough shot attempts, and the team needed him to score that much, that over the course of 82 games, he was going to average, 22 plus points per game, and he would have enough hot stretches to where the efficiency would look pretty decent. As opposed to now that he's not the foundation, that he's your, I would say, probably third option amongst the starters in terms of usage. The question becomes, how do you get him to be efficient if he can't feel his way into a game through dribbling the ball, through putting up a lot of shots? That's the trick. And I think it's something that we probably underestimated going into this season as something that was going to be difficult for him. Whereas the first couple of years, he could dribble the air out of the ball if he wanted. He can put up as many shots. Now, if things aren't going his way, there's more pressure for the Rockets because they're trying to win to turn to other options. So beyond the fact that his makes tend to come in bunches and that he's a little streaky, I also think it's tricky for him. If it's not his game, can he switch gears on the fly and eventually find it? I think that's been difficult for him. Now, the upside, because this stylistically is very different than the first couple of years, we can't really say that we've had 2.5 years of trying to get Jalen to play this way. No, we basically had not even a half year. So there is still time for him to, I guess, adjust to this dynamic. But right now, I think that's really what he's struggling with.
Yeah, and the whole adjustment period for him, that's where the whole argument kind of comes in, is just,
sure.
You can make the argument, sure, this is Jalen's having to adjust. He's had the biggest adjustment, I think, of all the Rockets young guys, right? You look at Sengun, you look at Jabari. Jalen has the biggest adjustment to make of all of them because of how much of a leash he had during the Stephen Silas era of basketball. And now he's got a completely different role. He's being expected to do a lot of different things. He's expected to actually put forth energy on the defensive side of the basketball. Ime Udoka wants him to be a more well-rounded player, and we've seen him take steps in the right direction. We've seen him improve in a variety of different ways, in his game, the playmaking, the defense, all of it. It's just, it really does kind of boil down to his role on this team offensively. He's expected to just knock down open shots. And there's some games where he's knocking down the open looks that he's getting, and it's great. But then there's games like I highlighted in that list of just, again, the last 10 games alone, right? There's some games where he's a knockdown, dead-eye three-point shooter. And then there's other games where he doesn't even hit a single three out of his 4 or 5 attempts. So it's that high degree of variance, unfortunately, where some games he's good and some games he's really bad offensively from three. And that's what is kind of the issue here when you can go to a guy on the bench like an Aaron Holiday, or, at times a Tari Eason, even when he's available. Or now you've got Cam Whitmore breathing down Jalen Green's neck, right behind him in the hierarchy, in the pecking order, whatever, as an upcoming two guard who Cam has zero issues when it comes to his offensive game. He knows he's a bucket. He's shooting lights out right now, and he's doing it in a very small amount of run. So if you were to, theoretically scale that production up for Cam Whitmore, would he be able to give you 20 points a game right now on good efficiency? Probably not. He's a rookie. He's going to make mistakes. But when you're seeing the flashes of Cam and you're seeing what the other guys can provide, that becomes the whole argument, is how much of a leash does Jalen Green get this year, right? Do you sacrifice the wins in order to continue to give Jalen those developmental reps? Yeah, and I don't know, because everything you kind of described, Ben, when you were highlighting, hey, Jalen's a rhythm guy, he needs to feel the ball in his hands, maybe he gets going, maybe he doesn't. All of these things, all the ways in which we kind of describe Jalen's game right now, feels like the descriptors of a sixth man, at least right now. And I hate that that's kind of where we're at right now. And I don't want it to be like, oh, I'm completely out on Jalen Green. I would love for him to turn into an all-star. I would love for him to figure it out and become like an all-star, superstar, whatever caliber player. I just haven't seen enough of it, right? It's just, this has kind of been the book on Jalen Green to this point in his career. And maybe he is a sixth man. And if that's what his role is, if that's who he is as an NBA player, that's okay. There have been other players who have been drafted as like high, top overall picks who have not quite lived up to the standards of where they were drafted, but then still made themselves into quality, winning NBA caliber players because they carved out a role for themselves. And at least right now, I just don't see how Jalen's skill set doesn't exactly complement the rest of the Rockets starters. It feels a little dicey at best. And that's just kind of where it feels like things are at with this team.
Well, in the Miami game, he was better as a facilitator with 6 assists, but the trick with that and where it gets difficult, even if he's better as a facilitator, he's not as good as Fred or Alpi in that area. So there's a point of diminishing returns. I mean, it's nice that he takes strides, but at the same time, it's not something that you're going to lean on all that heavily, especially when you get to crunch time, because there are better options. The thing you could always use from Jalen is the shooting, the floor spacing, and that's something that will sort of buy him minutes. If he can just shoot at a respectable level and space the floor, that's going to give him so much of a longer leash from Ime Udoka that it will give him the time he needs to develop in these other areas. So that's why I'm really watching the shooting. That's the intermediate step, it feels like. Something he can do in the interim just to provide value at all times. And perhaps as the weeks, the months, the years progress, then he develops in some of those other areas. But to the point on him being a rhythm player, 2 games that really stood out to me from this recent stretch. You mentioned Phoenix, where he was 6 of 12 from 3, and I believe he was pretty good against Minnesota on Friday. Those were 2 where the Rockets were largely uncompetitive for most of that game. And so because of that, it's a lower leverage situation. And so those were the closest games that sort of felt like last year or the year before that. And that because it's lower leverage, then the Rockets at times went out of their comfort zone. It wasn't just spamming, Fred and Alpi pick and roll. You were sort of desperate. And so because of that, he got to take a few more, Jalen shots from the first couple of years, and he made them, and that's great. But the question is, how does that eventually translate into a structure where, at least for this season, Alpi and Fred are the focal points? And that, again, that's still very much a work in progress. I'm not out on him because, again, it's a little bit of a disservice to Jalen what happened the last couple of years. I think he's really in his first year being asked to play this way in this particular role. So there's hope that it comes in time. But yeah, I'm with you. Like, it's nice that he's clearly bounced back from a bad December. There have been positive steps, but in terms of whether it makes sense for the Rockets within their starting lineup and if it can contribute to wins at a high level, that's still very much a work in progress, I would say.
Yeah. Man, we talked about doing good, then bad, and then more good, and I kind of just completely pump faked us into another bad segment, so I apologize for that. But final thing here, because I did remember I remember asking our listeners to kind of earmark the 2 points that we made earlier, the lack of shooting on this roster, which we kind of already highlighted again, talking about Jalen's shooting struggles, and whether the shooting is real or not, as well as the lack of interior presence when Alperen Sengun goes to the bench. So, Ben, in your eyes right now, what do you see as the biggest roster need for this team? Because part of it's just like, if they could get healthy, I feel like they'd be better. Like, missing Dillon and Tari sucks. But even with those 2 guys are healthy, I feel like this team is maybe a piece away from being a well-rounded competitor, a bottom end playoff caliber team with the stride that Sengun has taken, or the strides that Sengun has taken this year, the young guys getting better game by game. It feels like they're missing one more piece. If you could, it doesn't have to be a specific player, but like, what skill set are you eyeing if you're Rafael Stone looking at this roster?
For me, it's clearly a backup big, because I think you have to consider not just what you're adding to the roster, but also what you're subtracting in terms of minutes. And while they could certainly use more shooting, at the same time, I'm not willing to decrease minutes for someone like Jalen Green or even Cam Whitmore, who's shown flashes of late, for the sake of a guy who can give you a short-term bump. Yeah, it might help you steal a game or 2 this season, but ultimately you're not going to win a title this year anyway. And so that's why I am willing to experiment with Jalen and Cam and to give them a little bit of a longer leash. And so when we talk about potentially adding shooting, I mean, there's a reason why the Rockets, even though they have Reggie Bullock, a guy who was a productive rotation player as recently as last season, and he's not really in this rotation because the Rockets are trying to balance not just now, well, they're trying to balance now with the future and to try and make sure that it makes sense on multiple timelines. And so that's why we've seen Cam Whitmore and not Reggie Bullock get these opportunities, as Tari has unfortunately ran into injury issues again in recent days. So because of that, especially with the Rockets, I'm guessing unwilling to trade a future first-round pick. My guess is with the Brooklyn picks increasing in value based on the Nets struggling, I think the Rockets probably hold on to those first-round picks unless it's a true superstar, and I don't know who that would be at this deadline. So my guess is you sort of push that back a little bit. And as far as a deal at this deadline, you're looking into sort of consolidating all those second-round picks you have this year because you won't be able to roster those guys anyway. I just think in terms of not just what this team needs, but also who you would subtract minutes from, I think adding a rim protecting big who could give you minutes in matchups where Jeff Green, loved the guy, but you know, there's certain matchups that are more suited for him than others.
He's also 30. Like he's
yeah,
a small ball
he's also 37 years old, and so there's potential if the Rockets use him this way all season that maybe his play falls off. So to me, reallocating some of those minutes from Jeff to someone that can fill a different role, and also a different role than Alpi. Let's be honest. I mean, there's certain matchups that can even be difficult for Alpi.
A stylistic difference.
Yeah, a stylistic difference. To me, that's the clear upgrade the Rockets can make that wouldn't have negative repercussions in terms of who the minutes are taken away from.
I saw somebody float the idea of a trade the other day. Reggie Bullock for Jackson Hayes, because the Lakers need shooting. Rockets need a little size. Jackson Hayes has fallen out of the Lakers rotation over these last 4 or 5 games or so. Pardon me. So I wouldn't hate that trade. I mean, Reggie Bullock.
I wouldn't either.
You know, I love the signing at the time. He really hasn't had a place in this rotation. He's played some spot minutes here and there. I wouldn't mind having Jackson Hayes on the bench because I think he gives you that stylistic change, gives you a lengthy big, someone who can play over the top, a lob threat, if you will.
Lob threat. So,
and again, a stylistic change away from Alpi, away from Jeff Green, because then you could still use Jeff as like a 4, as a 3 at times. You can, you know, we've seen Ime get creative with how he deploys Jeff Green, but I do think another piece behind Alperen Sengun is probably the biggest roster need. I would say a better, more established NBA backup point guard for Fred would be right up there as far as the list of needs goes, but that also directly inhibits the runtime for a guy like a Min Thompson, who you want to be able to get those developmental minutes. So it's like, okay, do you really want a Band-Aid fix and have like a Tyus Jones on the roster for 10 to 12 minutes a night, and then a Min Thompson's not getting any run, not getting to handle the basketball? You got to live with some of those lumps, unfortunately, for the long-term goals of getting him into a place where he is a starting caliber, ideally down the line, a star level point guard. But on that note, Ben, you know the drill. Let everyone know where to track you down at.
Yep. Ben DuBose on Twitter/X, the Rockets Wire and the Logger Line on the same, and rocketswire.usatoday.com for all your daily Houston Rockets news coverage.
And that's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Rockets. As always, thank you so much for checking out the show. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, the Odyssey app, or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know your thoughts on the Reggie Bullock for Jackson Hayes trade. Would you be up for that one? Do you have another target in mind for the Houston Rockets? Give us your thoughts on the entire episode. Alperen Sengun's all-star chances, the Rockets' concerning lack of defense as of late, Jalen Green's shooting numbers. Let us know all your thoughts in the YouTube comments. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.